It began with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the heavy silence that follows the sound of gunfire and screams. In the streets of Dar es Salaam, the morning light revealed what the night had tried to hide: ballot boxes stuffed before dawn, soldiers at polling stations, and an entire nation disconnected from the world as the internet went dark. And then the headline flashed across African media: AU chairman congratulates President Samia Suluhu Hassan on her victory. But hours later, that same African Union, through its own commission, declared the Tanzanian election neither free nor fair nor transparent. It was like watching a mask fall off in slow motion. A revelation that democracy, once celebrated, had become theater scripted, directed, and performed for the cameras while citizens bled in silence backstage. The contradictions were stunning. How could one part of the African Union praise an election while another condemned it? How could the very guardians of democracy celebrate what their own observers described as manipulation, intimidation, and deceit? This is not just about Tanzania. It is about what happens when those who are meant to protect the people begin to protect power instead. It is about an entire continent standing at a crossroads between the dream of freedom and the machinery of control. For Americans who remember the civil rights marches of Selma or the protests of the 1960s, this story may feel painfully familiar: ordinary people demanding to be heard, only to be silenced by the same systems claiming to represent them. So as Africa's old guards exchange handshakes in Addis Ababa, one question remains: can we still trust the African Union to defend democracy, or has it become another shield for the powerful? Please share this video if you believe justice in Africa deserves a voice. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. The truth came out not through politicians, but through the quiet voices of observers, the men and women of the African Union's election mission. Their report, once hidden in sealed folders, finally saw the light of day, and it was devastating. According to the African Union Observer Mission, the Tanzanian election that handed President Samia Suluhu Hassan her first elected term was anything but democratic. The observers documented what they called a systematic manipulation of the people's will. They described polling stations where voters were handed multiple ballots to vote more than once. In others, ballot boxes were already half full before voting even began. Internet shutdowns crippled communication. Journalists were silenced. Independent observers were detained or threatened. The report even stated that in several polling centers, only presidential ballot boxes were visible, as if parliamentary votes had vanished into thin air. Counting agents whispered that tallies didn't match. Numbers were changed overnight. Votes disappeared, and yet somehow the ruling party still managed to win by an unbelievable 99%. And then came the contradiction that shocked an entire continent. While the African Union chairman Mahmoud appeared on camera congratulating Samia Suluhu on her historic victory, the African Union Commission, the union's executive arm, came out with a completely opposite statement just hours later. The commission admitted that the elections were neither free nor fair, citing violations of every core AU principle governing democratic conduct. It condemned the government for suppressing the press, for shutting down the internet, and for allowing citizens to vote without any form of identification, a recipe for electoral chaos. Even more striking, the AU Commission's findings mirrored a second independent report from the Southern African Development Community, SADC, a regional bloc Tanzania itself belongs to. The SADC mission bluntly declared, in most areas, voters could not express their democratic will. The 2025 general election in the United Republic of Tanzania fell short of the SADC principles and guidelines governing democratic elections. That single statement echoed through Africa like thunder. For decades, election reports in Africa had been diplomatic, cautious, veiled, and polite. But not this time. SADC called it what it was: a failure of democracy. As the news spread, stories began to emerge from the ground. A teacher in Arusha who tried to live-stream the vote was arrested and hasn't been seen since. In Mwanza, police stormed a polling center after opposition agents refused to sign forged tallies. In Dar es Salaam, women waiting in line to vote were beaten with rifle butts after asking why their names were missing from the register. And yet, amid all this chaos, the government declared victory with smiles, parades, and speeches about unity and progress. It was the perfect image of control. But as one Tanzanian journalist whispered before his feed went dark, they control the airwaves, but not the truth. The truth will find its way. Soon it did. The AU Commission's preliminary report, backed by SADC, spread across international media. Human rights groups joined in confirming mass arrests, arbitrary detentions, and the killings of civilians. The contradiction was now impossible to ignore. How could one African Union leader celebrate a victory that his own commission had already discredited? How could the organization meant to uphold Africa's democratic values fall into such moral confusion? The silence that followed was deafening from Addis Ababa to Washington. And in that silence, one truth began to crystallize: democracy in Africa was bleeding, and Tanzania had become its latest wound. The contradiction inside the African Union triggered something far greater than diplomatic confusion. It ignited a storm of outrage across the continent. When the African Union Commission officially declared that Tanzania's election was neither free nor fair, while the AU chairman continued to congratulate President Samia Suluhu Hassan, it became the breaking point for millions of Africans who had long questioned the sincerity of their leaders. In Johannesburg, South Africa, a fiery voice rose above the rest. It was Julius Malema, leader of the Economic Freedom Fighters, his red beret gleaming beneath the sun as he faced the cameras. "There is no such thing as the African Union," he said. "It's a club of old men protecting each other, not the people. They don't call out injustice, they congratulate it." That statement exploded across the continent. Clips of Malema's speech flooded social media, shared by students in Ghana, activists in Nairobi, and exiled journalists from Zimbabwe. It was not just an attack on the AU, it was a cry of generational rebellion. In the universities of Dar es Salaam and Dodoma, youth organizations organized what they called the Second Uhuru Movement. Their posters carried a simple message: if our vote is stolen, our silence is betrayal. Protests began quietly, then they grew. From Arusha to Zanzibar, thousands marched waving torn Tanzanian flags, holding candles, and chanting the names of those who disappeared on election night. They weren't armed. They carried nothing but determination and grief. But the government responded with force. Security trucks rolled into the streets. The smell of tear gas filled the air. Internet lines were once again cut. Within hours, dozens were injured and several were dead. Meanwhile, the Southern African Development Community, SADC, doubled down on its findings, issuing a second report describing the Tanzanian elections as a staged operation where democracy was the stage and dictatorship the director. Those words cut deep. Even members within Tanzania's ruling party whispered that they had never seen international condemnation of this magnitude. As global headlines shifted from "Tanzania votes" to "Tanzania bleeds," human rights defenders began calling for international intervention. The Tanganyika Law Society denounced the government for mass arrests, unlawful killings, and systematic suppression of opposition. Several lawyers who filed petitions challenging the results were themselves detained under the country's Anti-Terrorism Act. And then the world took notice. The International Criminal Court, ICC, in The Hague announced a preliminary inquiry into alleged crimes against humanity committed during and after the elections. For the first time in Tanzania's history, a sitting president faced the possibility of being investigated for electoral violence. The announcement sent shockwaves through Dar es Salaam. Government spokespersons tried to deny the allegations, calling them foreign propaganda. But the images, the tear gas, the dead bodies, the soldiers patrolling empty streets told a different story. Inside Tanzania, fear mixed with defiance. One journalist, speaking anonymously to BBC Swahili, said, "We are told to forget, but we cannot. Our brothers are in graves. Our democracy is in a coffin, but we are still breathing." And perhaps that was the most powerful moment, when ordinary Tanzanians, despite the fear, refused to be silenced. They began printing leaflets, organizing underground meetings, and reaching out to diaspora networks. At night, in the shadow of government curfews, they sang old liberation songs from the Nyerere era, songs of hope, unity, and defiance. Across the continent, from Dakar to Kinshasa, people listened and echoed the same refrain: Tanzania's fight is Africa's fight. The flames of anger had turned into something deeper, a collective awakening. The continent was no longer just watching. It was remembering that democracy is not a gift from above, but a duty from below. When the smoke cleared, what remained was fear and silence. The protests had been crushed. The internet was still down in several regions. Streets once filled with chants were now guarded by armored trucks and faceless soldiers. But silence does not mean peace. It only means that people are whispering instead of shouting. In Arusha, traders closed their shops, afraid of being associated with the opposition. In Mwanza, young men vanished overnight, taken from their homes without warrants. Families searched for them in police stations, morgues, and hospitals, often in vain. Mothers lit candles at night by their doors, praying their sons would come back. Civil society organizations, the same ones that had once campaigned for voter education, now focused on legal defense and trauma support. The Tanganyika Law Society filed a petition accusing the government of violating constitutional rights, including freedom of expression, assembly, and access to information. Their offices were raided days later. Across the nation, fear became the new currency. University professors stopped discussing politics. Radio hosts began each program with the same phrase, "Let us focus on unity." But beneath that fragile calm, a quiet rebellion was taking shape. Young Tanzanians in exile began building what they called the People's Archive. It was a digital repository of evidence, photos, videos, testimonies from Election Day stored on foreign servers beyond the government's reach. From Nairobi and Kampala, Tanzanian journalists in exile started small YouTube channels reading names of the disappeared, keeping memories alive. And yet the government continued to project normalcy. State media aired cheerful programs about national development and women's empowerment. President Samia Suluhu Hassan appeared in colorful Kitinge dresses, smiling, attending summits, shaking hands. But behind that image, international pressure was mounting. The Southern African Development Community SADC called for Tanzania to be temporarily suspended until it restored democratic order. The African Union Commission, under pressure from human rights organizations, reaffirmed that the 2025 elections fell below all accepted democratic standards. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court ICE expanded its inquiry, citing credible evidence of crimes committed during electoral suppression. Diplomatic relations grew tense. Western embassies quietly reduced non-humanitarian aid. The European Union requested a full audit of electoral processes. Inside Tanzania's parliament, a few brave members of the opposition demanded President Samia's resignation, only to be escorted out by security officers. Ordinary Tanzanians, once proud of their nation's reputation for peace, began to question whether they were now living under the same shadows that once haunted neighboring regimes. For a country that had been the birthplace of Julius Nyerere's dream of African unity and moral leadership, this was a painful reckoning. The social consequences were even deeper. Trust in institutions collapsed. Religious leaders reported rising anxiety, depression, and emigration among young people. A generation that had believed in democracy now saw it as a performance, a stage managed by power, not people. But in that despair, a spark remained. Small communities began meeting again, not to protest, but to rebuild. Law students offered free legal aid to arrested activists. Women's groups organized silent marches where they carried white scarves instead of placards. And in every gathering, one name was whispered as a symbol of courage and reform: Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso, the soldier president who had defied foreign influence and declared, "Leadership is not about luxury, it is about sacrifice." For many Tanzanians, his example became a mirror, a reminder that the African dream was not dead. It was just waiting for leaders brave enough to live it. From Washington to Brussels, the echoes of Tanzania's election scandal reached diplomatic halls that once claimed to defend democracy. The United States State Department issued a carefully worded statement calling for restraint and dialogue. But for many, those words sounded painfully hollow. Senators from the U.S. Foreign Relations Committee demanded more. One of them, speaking during a Capitol Hill briefing, said plainly, "If the African Union cannot enforce its own democratic principles, the United States cannot keep pretending that democracy in Africa is thriving." It was an uncomfortable truth. For decades, America had poured millions into democracy assistance programs across Africa, funding elections, training observers, printing ballots. And yet here was Tanzania, once considered a model of stability, descending into the same spiral of repression that those very programs were meant to prevent. In editorial columns across the Atlantic, European and American commentators began to ask the same question: has democracy become just another export product, sold, packaged, and abandoned when inconvenient? The BBC, The Guardian, and The New York Times all ran features exposing the contradiction between the African Union's celebration and condemnation of the same election. One American journalist wrote, "This is the clearest sign that Africa's democratic institutions have been compromised by the very leaders meant to protect them." At the United Nations in New York, a Tanzanian diaspora delegation presented a petition to the UN Human Rights Council urging an international inquiry into the killings. Their voices trembled, but their message was firm. We are not asking for intervention. We are asking for attention. The world slowly but surely began to listen. Canada suspended its election support fund for Tanzania. Germany called for a joint AU-EU investigation. And in France, human rights organizations projected images of Tanzanian protesters on the walls of the African Union's Paris office, a haunting reminder that silence is complicity. Yet in the midst of diplomatic statements and legal inquiries, a quieter movement began to rise not from the halls of power, but from the hearts of ordinary people. African Americans and church groups in the U.S. South, particularly in Georgia and Alabama, started organizing Pray for Tanzania vigils, recalling their own struggles for the right to vote. Elderly men and women veterans of the civil rights era shared their solidarity online, saying, "We marched in Selma so others could vote. We cannot stay silent when Tanzanians bleed for the same right." The moral weight of that comparison was undeniable. For those who remember segregation, intimidation, and voter suppression in the American South, the story of Tanzania felt like déjà vu, a painful reflection of battles thought long won but still raging elsewhere. And amid that reflection, a new conversation began. Analysts and diplomats started referencing the Burkina Faso model, a term coined after Captain Ibrahim Traoré's reforms to restore civic dignity and economic sovereignty. They contrasted his leadership grounded in accountability and national pride with the hollow promises of many post-colonial elites. In that contrast lay a question not just for Africa, but for the entire world. What good are democratic institutions when they no longer serve the people? When the last ballot is burned and the last voice silenced, what remains of democracy? Tanzania's 2025 election was supposed to mark a new era for East Africa. Instead, it became a warning to the world. What happened there is not just a political scandal. It is a moral mirror held up to every government, every international institution, and every citizen who believes in justice. Because silence, whether in Addis Ababa, Washington, or Brussels, is not neutrality. It is complicity. Across the continent, the images from Dar es Salaam still linger: women running from tear gas, students beaten in the streets, journalists dragged from their studios. Those scenes echo the ghosts of another era, apartheid South Africa, colonial Rhodesia, or Jim Crow America times, when the system demanded obedience and punished truth. And yet, amid that darkness, there is light. It shines from unexpected places, from Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey nations, once dismissed as unstable, now rising under new leadership to reclaim their destiny. In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré reminds the world that democracy must begin with dignity, not with paperwork. He teaches that sovereignty is not given by foreign observers, it is built by citizens who refuse to surrender their conscience. The tragedy of Tanzania is that it trusted the machinery of democracy more than the morality of leadership. The hope for Africa is that others are beginning to see through the illusion, to rebuild systems that serve the people, not those who rule them. As Americans, many of us remember a time when the right to vote was not guaranteed, when courage meant standing in front of dogs and fire hoses for the simple act of marking a ballot. That memory should not fade. Because today, somewhere in Africa, another young man or woman is standing in line facing the same fear just to be counted. So, the question now belongs to all of us. Will we watch Africa's democracy die behind a veil of polite statements? Or will we, as citizens of a shared human story, raise our voices again not as saviors, but as witnesses? If you believe that truth still matters more than convenience, please share this story. If you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of justice, humility, and self-reliance represents the Africa the world deserves to see, subscribe and stand with us. Because the fight for Tanzania is not over, and the rebirth of Africa has just begun.